Good evening, everybody. Great. It's wonderful to see all of you here. This is the 9th in our series, our global lecture series, and I am really thrilled to see all of you here for it tonight. I'm Julie Mostov, the Dean of Liberal Studies, and this is really part of our celebration of GLS at 10, which is this whole year, 2019, 2020. So I want you all to know that last time we were here, this looked like a party, and it really was a festive occasion, but we continue with that in having one of my favorite authors, Professor Lila Abu-Lughod, speak with us here tonight. Professor Abu-Lughod is the Joseph L. Butenweiser Professor of Social Science at Columbia University, where she teaches anthropology and gender studies. A leading voice in the debates about culture, gender, Islam, and global feminist politics. Her award-winning books and articles have been translated into 14 languages. The books include Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in a Bedouin Society, Writing Women's Worlds, Dramas of Nationhood, The Politics of Television in Egypt, Nakba, Palestine 1948 and the Claims of Memory, and her 2013 book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Her scholarship, drawing on long-term fieldwork in Egypt, focuses on the power of cultural forms, from poetry to television soap operas, the politics of knowledge and representation of cultural others, violence and memory, and the question of liberalism and global projects of human and women's rights. She's been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, a Carnegie Scholar, and a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow. Her research has been supported by awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Fulbright, the Social Science Research Council, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She taught at Williams, Princeton, and NYU before moving to, well, uptown to Columbia in 2000, where she has since directed the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Middle East Institute, and the Center for the Study of Social Difference. She's on the board of the New Palestinian Museum in Birzeit and is currently working on a collaborative international project for women creating change, supported by the Henry Luce Foundation on Religion and the Global Framing of Gender Violence. Now, I was first acquainted with Professor Abu-Lughod in 2002 when I came across her incredible article, Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving? Anthropological Reflections on Cultural Relativism and Its Others. I have taught that article for, well, what is that? 18 years or so. My math's not great, but almost. Not only at my former university, here with my Dean Circle students from last year, but also with all of my graduate students from many countries in the Balkans from a graduate program at the University of Sarajevo. And so it really is a major thrill for me to be able to host her here at NYU for our 9th annual Global Lecture Series. In fact, I know that having said that, a number of my colleagues here at NYU have also used Professor Abu-Lughod's articles and books in their classrooms. Before going on, I want to remind all of you, you have these little cards that you're sitting on together with your chocolates. They're not to make thank you notes for the chocolates, but I'll accept those. These are actually to write some questions down. Because we probably won't get a chance to answer everybody's questions, we do want to make sure that Professor Abu-Lughod knows what the questions were and hears from all of you. So we will collect those as soon as the talk is over for a Q&A session. Now, before going on, I just want to thank all of the members of our committee and Professor Dina Siddiqui, who were really critical in making sure that we selected a speaker who reflects the global, interdisciplinary, and engaged scholarship, which is so important to liberal studies. So I want to thank them all. I want to thank our co-sponsors who may be here tonight, the New York Center for the Humanities, the Islamic Center at NYU, and the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. I'm thanking all of them, and of course, again, our staff, Dee, the incomparable Dee, who helped everybody put this together. Lara Williamson, who put together this poster with the help of Lila's daughter, and Danica Lamb, who's back there, and Jeff. Right, okay. I want to make sure that I have everybody's name there. And thank you all. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Lila Abu-Lughod.
Thank you so much, and thank you, for being here. Thanks for the very generous introduction, and for all being here after the crazy snow and all the scrambling you're probably doing to catch up after Thanksgiving. I'm really thrilled to be back at NYU, where I actually spent many happy years of my life. And I'm grateful to friends and colleagues who are here tonight. And I'm really honored to have been invited to give the annual Global Lecture for this fabulous program in liberal studies, which I think did not exist when I was here. And now I hear why, because it's only 10 years old. So congratulations on that. And I wanted to thank Dean Mostoff and everyone who made this possible, the incomparable Dee, of course, and all the other people behind the scenes. But also wanted to thank you for persuading me that I could still be global, even if I was just up the road, and I needed a little bit of persuading for that. I wanted to thank you for being gracious and efficient and organizing everything, and I'm thinking especially of Dee, who we've had many, many emails back and forth. And I wanted to thank you for the fabulous poster, which I guess you see the whole thing here, which is made from a photograph that my daughter took in Egypt. And I love it so much, and I love the poster so much that I'm thinking now maybe it'll be the cover of our book that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So what I wanted to do was to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last 3 years or so. That's been something of a departure for me as an anthropologist who spent most of her time going back and forth to different parts of rural Egypt and writing about different aspects of social and cultural life in communities there, writing about everything, as you heard, from love poetry to television soap operas, moral systems to women's concepts of women's rights. And what's different for me in this project is that it has been a collaborative and collective project that's brought me in touch with a group of feminist scholars from whom I've learned so much, and I'm looking at one of them right now. And our project was called, it was supposed to be on religion and the global framing of gender violence. And it crosses disciplines, so I'm glad it's interdisciplinary. It brings together legal scholars, anthropologists, sociologists, a lot of anthropologists, I have to say. But it also crosses global regions, in the Middle East and South Asia in particular. And we brought together scholars who come from and work in a wide range of countries in these regions, India, Jordan, Iraq, Pakistan, Iran, Palestine, Bangladesh, who you've got on your wonderful faculty in liberal studies. And we also brought in feminist scholars who study countries and institutions that shape what happens to people in those parts of the world as well. So from the US to the UN to the International Criminal Court. And we're now trying to pull it all together in a book. This is a work in progress. I wish it were done, but it's not. It's a work in progress. So I'm actually very much looking forward to your questions, to your comments, to reactions to what I'm about to say, because it's not too late to change things, and it will help us actually pull the thing together. So what brought all of us together in this project was this kind of nagging sense that we needed to look more closely at the way gender violence was being framed in the global arena. And we'd noticed, as I'm sure many of you have too, that over the last couple of decades or so, violence against women, sometimes known as VOW, and subsequently gender-based violence, usually known as GBV, had emerged as powerful master categories in agendas of international governance and law. What had once been maybe marginalized feminist concerns, radical feminist concerns about the gravity of violence against women and the silences around those kinds of violences now appear to sit firmly in the nexus of powerful global networks of institutions and practices. And as my colleague Rima Hamami in this project put it, these categories have recast development and humanitarianism in line with post-9/11 global security regimes. I don't know how to say things like that. She's good at that kind of summing up. So how did this happen? Even in popular consciousness and media, gender violence has emerged as a serious problem that demands solutions, whether through international tribunals focusing on rape and war, or even in the Me Too movement that has taken off through the internet. How did a courageous feminist cause to combat gender violence become so imbricated in global, national, and local systems of power? It took hard work by feminist activists for sure, but something else seems to have happened that I don't think had been their intention. You might even think that what they cared about has been hijacked. As we shared our research, we realized that what we wanted to talk about, was about this kind of situation that's developed is not whether it succeeded or failed, the attempt to combat gender violence, because there aren't any simple answers and there aren't any measures for telling whether you've succeeded or succeeded or failed. But instead, we thought maybe we needed to look at the modes and the channels of the operation of these master categories of violence against women, gender-based violence, and even SGBV, sexual or gender-based violence. And from now on, mostly I'm going to use the term gender violence, and I mean VOW, I mean GBV, but every time you say all those acronyms, you get all tangled up. So you know what I mean. Those are the master categories, but I'm going to call them the simple thing of gender violence. So instead of seeing this as a feminist victory, of finally bringing to public consciousness the harms and the wrongs of these forms of violence, we began to ask how this emerging consensus was being played out on the ground in different places and in specific sorts of practices and under very different sorts of political and social conditions. We wanted to look closely at the actual social and political effects of this kind of convergence on the wrongness, the moral wrongness, the legal wrongness of gender violence. Am I doing it? Is that right? That's what we're doing, right? So signs of the consensus about the harms of gender violence are all around us. We can see them in attempts at national legal reforms in many, many countries, including here. We can see them in annual international rituals like the UN Women's 16 Days Against Violence Against Women, which happens every year and in different places. We can see them in war crime tribunals at the International Criminal Court. And we can see them in the high priority accorded to gender-based violence in the funding of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, for those of you who don't know, INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, GONGOs, government or non-governmental organizations, and locally based grassroots organizations around the world. What figures circulate among these institutions to animate and justify their work? There's domestic violence, there's rape and war, there's child marriage, there's so-called harmful traditional practices. And recently, I think the specter of sexual slavery has taken center stage. Where did the statistics, in the sense of those kind of figures, come from about the prevalence? We don't know. But these statistics are everywhere. There's 5,000 of these, 2,000 of those. Every 5 minutes, something happens. We're given all these statistics, but we actually don't know what they refer to or how they were achieved or gathered. So what's all this about? And how does the way that the problems are framed affect actual individuals and groups who are the subjects of this violence? Who and what do these efforts empower? And who and what do they marginalize? Who pays the price for the way perpetrators are identified and for the silences around some sources of violence? Now, I'm throwing out a lot of questions here to give you a general sense of the kinds of reservations that we had as we started to look closely at the global conversations around gender violence. And so today, what I'm going to do is share with you a few things that I think we've figured out that we think are crucial to think about if we really do care about the human harms of gender violence, which we absolutely must do, right? So, because of the regions where we work, when we began, we imagined that we'd be investigating, in particular, the role of religion in naming, framing, and governing gender violence. But we realized we couldn't disconnect the framing or the narratives about gender violence from the forms and politics of inquiry, the techniques of measurement, the social technologies of interventions to address gender violence. And now we're thinking about these interconnected features as the kind of political and institutional circuits that the master categories of gender violence animate, traverse, inhabit, or consolidate. This sounds a bit grand. And I'll repeat it, right? But it's helpful to think critically about something that should be just a matter of moral right and wrong, but isn't. So let me repeat the question that is sort of guiding our thinking. What are the political and institutional circuits of global power that the master categories of gender violence are now animating, inhabiting, and even consolidating? Okay. So in the second part of my lecture, I'm going to go into more detail about one of the three circuits of power that gender violence seems to inhabit: security. When I talk about my own contribution to this project and a little bit about someone else's. So thinking about security. But first, let me sort of fill in the context in case maybe everybody who's read Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving doesn't need the context, but let me fill in the context for those who don't, or to help you see why some of us are worried about the misuse or abuse or instrumentalization of gender violence. At the time of the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the harnessing of gender violence to legitimize a violent military intervention in the name of humanitarianism, humanitarian rescue, seemed sort of exceptional. As many of you know, although looking around the room, I guess some of you won't remember this, and so you have to count on those of us who do remember it. Taliban restrictions and atrocities against Afghan women were used to justify the invasion in the name of saving Afghan women, and by extension, saving Muslim women. And it got sort of blurred. Later, the same excuse was trotted out to justify invading Iraq in a minor way and toppling its regime. So I wrote about the intervention in Afghanistan at the time, and many of you have, I guess, read or at least been assigned an article that I wrote called "Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving?" And this article actually became the starting point for a book that I would work on for the next decade, and we academics are very slow, you're beginning to realize, by almost the same name, Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Not really, just need. And the years since 2001 have seen gender violence become even more entangled with imperial geopolitics. The master categories of violence against women and gender-based violence are circulating in ever-expanding arenas. There's probably no better evidence of the public success of what had begun as a radical feminist effort to produce a global consensus around the wrongs of gender-based violence than the choice of the winners for the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize. The prize was shared, as you probably know, by two individuals, Nadia Murad and Dr. Denis Mukwege. Both were commended for campaigning against rape and sexual assault as a weapon of war. Dr. Mukwege is a courageous physician who for decades has been treating sexual assault victims in his war-torn country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nadia Murad was then a 25-year-old Yazidi woman from Iraq who had been abducted and then escaped to what is now labeled sexual slavery by Daesh, or ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Now, the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to these two figures, I think, captures perfectly the paradoxes that we're struggling with in our project. Is this a crowning achievement for feminists who wanted the world to take gender-based violence seriously? Or is something else going on here that should give us pause? Both the sexual and genocidal violence against the Yazidis in Iraq by Muslim fighters and the luridly publicized sexual violence of the ongoing conflict, political conflict in the DRC, produce horror and pity for the victims. But notice that even as the prize claims to recognize the personal and political courage of these two individuals, it firmly locates the savagery of the violators among racialized and distant others. Women are here presented as victims whose violated and injured bodies need outside protection by militarized intervention, if necessary, as in recent proposals to militarize peacekeeping forces in Congo, and of course, the ongoing US military and financial support for crushing ISIS after it had created the very conditions for the rise of ISIS through the invasion and restructuring of Iraq. Now, every feminist and every sane person knows, and every study shows, that militarization inevitably creates conditions for greater violence against women, among other human beings that we might care about. But this prize makes the West appear the champion of women and an innocent moral savior with no role in having produced or sustained the conflicts that have enabled the horrific forms of gender violence that Nadia Murad experienced or that Dr. Mukwege treats. Don't we need to ask a few questions about how this virtuous condemnation of violence, but only by Muslim and African men, dovetails with geopolitical interests? Don't we need to ask why some kinds of violence and some perpetrators are more worthy of attention than others? What we are looking at in our project are the kind of selective ways a visionary feminist agenda has somehow got folded into world affairs. Just because the cause of fighting gender violence is worthy And even if it may be just, right, correct, to punish those who commit such violence, this doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to the geopolitics that propel the funding, the production of knowledge and policy, and the particular interventions that accompany these efforts. We need to ask sober questions, concrete questions about the boons that these efforts offer to policy experts, to journalists, to arms dealers, to security personnel, to contractors, to politicians, to armies, to militias, to therapists, to femocrats, to human rights lawyers, and to democracy experts. And what about the women and the others who are subjected to this violence? What does the agenda do for the survivors? Close studies of those that I've read, of those in refugee camps and clinics, show that they're sometimes made further targets of violence. Sometimes their dignity and their social ties are damaged. Often, their views of and understandings of their situations are ignored or distorted, and often, very often, others sensationalize what they themselves might rather leave behind. So tracking carefully when and where gender violence becomes visible, the apparatuses in which the master categories operate, and the networks along which the constructs travel does more than help us understand something about gender and violence. I think it actually exposes key features of the intersecting political orders and uneven force fields of our current world. And that's the strong claim that we're actually going to be putting forward in our book. Yes, we want to know how the master categories of gender violence travel. What are its channels? What are its paths? What are its means? We think of this as its political ecologies. Yes, we want to pay attention to the category of gender violence as an object of knowledge and as deployed in social interventions. We want to know what it produces in the world, from political alliances and institutional structures to legal reforms to social movements to NGOs to social media to detention centers and human rights claims, even Nobel Prizes. And yes, we want to figure out how modes of visibilizing and invisibilizing gender violence define and actually confine our fields of vision, masking or sidelining some of the powers and forces that actually inflict the most violence on women, children, and men. It's not enough to say patriarchy. It's not enough to say bad men, although you can say some of that, but no. Even bad religions that create bad men, right, which is the way it's often explained. So that's not enough. We want to explore all this by looking at the different circuits of power in which gender violence features. So one set of studies in our book examines the way gender, violence, and religion are co-implicated in the dominant political formations that we call the contemporary global security world order. Launched as part of the War on Terror after 9/11, the grip and reach of this ideological and militarized governance and surveillance formation have expanded dramatically over the last 2 decades. It's now common sense that we must extend international security regimes against terrorist threats. And this has cemented global alliances. It's escalated fear to justify proliferating measures and institutions, counterterrorism, and it's dramatically increased our compulsion to counter by any means whatsoever what now goes by the charged term violent extremism. And so I'll focus on this in the last part of my paper when I talk about my own work. So that's the first section. The second section of the book shifts the focus to the role of states and political parties in facilitating and even perpetuating gendered violence. This violence that is mostly hidden by the focus of GBV talk on universalist arguments about patriarchy or culturalist arguments about misogynist religions like Islam, needs to be looked at. The gender violence is directed towards citizens, colonial subjects, minorities within nation states, and while recognizing the way the way nation states are inevitably shaped by international power politics, I think we have to look at the states themselves, and they're different. And in the chapters of our book, we look at Israeli harassment of Palestinian schoolgirls in occupied East Jerusalem. We look at the meaning for women political prisoners of the threat of rape in the context of torture in Iranian prisons. We look at the collusion of political and religious authorities in blaming traditional culture for the murder of a social media star in Pakistan. And we look at the state-sanctioned communalism that provides fertile ground for the lynching of Muslim men in India today. And all of these, my colleagues expose the ways that gendered violence is inflicted by or is in the service of states and governments and their control. And what often goes sort of unremarked and unpunished are forms of what my colleague Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian calls state criminality. And she's working on that part of the book. States, police, their security forces are culpable for deadly sexual and gender violence in so many places, but they rarely figure as perpetrators in analyses of GBV or VAW. The third global power formation in which we see the master categories of gender violence actively operating is humanitarianism. And humanitarian care, whose claim is to be above politics, moral, humane, only there to mitigate the damage done to people and communities by wars and conflicts, which are treated almost like natural disasters. Humanitarianism is about sheltering and giving handouts to stave off starvation. Looking at the catastrophe of Gaza, at what queer and trans Iranian refugees in Turkey experience, or at attempts to protect girls from child marriage or forced marriage, as Dina is doing in Bangladesh, we find the feminist agenda to combat gender violence integral to the workings of humanitarian governance these days. Sometimes the master categories obfuscate or put off limits to actual problems voiced by the subjects of humanitarian care. Often, the anti-GBV agenda distracts attention from the larger structural and political economic causes of individuals' miseries: forced statelessness, loss of livelihood, family separations, joblessness, immiseration, or direct violence inflicted on trapped populations. And one of the young scholars in our group who worked in Tanzania in a refugee camp for Congolese mostly women and children, has documented how, like in incredible detail through her fieldwork, how the humanitarian apparatus actually now limits, by design and by master plan, cookie cutter, taken from place to place, it limits interventions for women to only one set of activities: human rights trainings to recognize domestic violence. No, we don't have money for soap. The internationals who run the camp respond brusquely when women ask for soap. But hey, we can give you another training in how to recognize abuse. No political analysis or intervention into the nation states that are actually forbidding the refugees from moving freely or crossing borders to safer and better places. That's outside the limits of what the humanitarians can do. So I want to go back now to the way gender violence figures in the first circuit of power. How are we doing for time? Good, okay. So I want to go back to the way gender violence figures in the first circuit of power I mentioned, which is security or securitization. I guess it's in the title, right? And that's where I've concentrated my work. And this section of the book includes an amazing article by Vasuki Nesaya, who teaches here at NYU. And she looks at the way French feminists especially celebrated the recent arrest by the International Criminal Court and charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity against Mr. El-Hassan Mahmoud of Timbuktu, Mali, the former head of police of the militant Islamic group that took over Timbuktu. Another chapter is by the University of California, Berkeley legal scholar, Letty Volpe, and she takes a really, like legal scholars do, a very close look at the surprising inclusion in President Trump's Muslim ban of a cultural category that has become what she and many other people call, a dog whistle for right-wing Islamophobes. And no offense to people who love dogs, but anyway. And this is the honor killing. And I've helped write an amicus brief to the Supreme Court against the use of this term in the executive order, but it didn't make it there. But Letty's done a perfect job on this. But I wanted to take the remaining time to talk about my own part in this, my own research into how gender violence operates in the security circuit. And I was led into this topic by students, so thank you, students, who've taken my courses at the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia, and especially some who were master's students in our School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA. They're not anthropologists, but they're interested in policy and politics. And through them, I sort of stumbled onto something that actually shocked me. I discovered that women's rights advocates had, over the past decade or so, begun clamoring for inclusion in the soft branch of the global security enterprise that goes under the trademark CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, or PVE, Preventing Violent Extremism. And I began to dig, I'm a scholar. What's this? I started reading this horrible stuff. Anyway, and I found that they were a very heterogeneous group, but I gave them the single name of securofeminists. To make sense of this. Now, securofeminism could be considered a strand of what the legal theorist Janet Halley and her colleagues have called in a 2-volume work, governance feminism. Governance feminism is defined as, quote, every form in which feminists and feminist ideas exert a governing will, unquote, but particularly as these have been incorporated into state-like, and state-affiliated power, or well beyond into other public and private governance networks. Securofeminists, when I kind of looked closely and started making the distinctions, they don't work, they work outside of official military and security sectors for the most part, but they definitely want to be part of networks of governance. Around security. And I have two problems. I'll give you, the spoiler. I have two problems with the securofeminists. First, they uncritically embrace the category violent extremism that's so central to security policies. And second, they justify their claims for inclusion and leadership of CVE by affirming the truism that violent extremists are the main perpetrators of gender-based violence. Some grassroots human rights advocates and gender policy experts who work closely with the institutions of international governance have cautioned against about the risks of engagement with security, and many of them have. So have some critical scholars of international human rights law and sociologists and anthropologists who are attuned to the dangers of the traffic between policy worlds and academia, especially around radicalization in Europe. But these cautions haven't had much traction, as securofeminists have thrown themselves behind CVE and PVE projects. And there are a lot of reasons you can think of for this. CVE appears to offer opportunities for feminists to influence policy. It offers opportunities to bolster careers. It offers opportunities to get lots of funding for their NGOs. And maybe if my study of the securofeminist literature on women's leadership in CVE is any guide, well-meaning feminists may have just been worn down by the numbing repetition of terms and frameworks that have accompanied the global security agenda's growing hegemony. And I'm an anthropologist. I had never read policy documents before. And let me tell you, they're dreary, they're deadly. It's a deadly genre. It's just so repetitive. You just can't think anymore after you read this stuff. So they're miring themselves in that, and I think they can't think straight anymore. But we should also remember that many women's rights advocates have a long-standing suspicion of or hostility to religion, and especially Islam. So securitization and its vilification of violent extremists may not have seemed so alien to them. Now, just before CVE emerged onto the international scene, Vasuki Nisaya, who I learned this from, wrote a really important article, arguing that the year 2000, marked the arrival of what she called international conflict feminism, ICF, with the UN Security Council's, and apologies if I'm don't do justice to the article, but with the UN Security Council's passage of Resolution 1325, which I'm sure some of you know about, on women, peace, and security, which was a hard-fought victory for women at the UN to highlight the gendered impact of war and to urge the incorporation of women into the peacekeeping process and post-conflict reconstruction. The way, with that passage of that resolution, the way was also opened for feminist inclusion in the field of global security. And she concluded her analysis of the earlier feminist controversies over the women, peace, and security agenda with a warning. She urged feminists to, quote, unpack the background assumptions and assess the distributive consequences of security, the rule of law, and a range of attendant political vocabularies and policy agendas that have shaped the normative common sense that brokered the marriage of ICF and counterterrorism, unquote. Now, I'm coming in later. With the shift to PVE or CVE, preventing or countering violent extremism, the main game in town since then, I think it's time to also assess the implications of securo-feminist appeals to what they call inclusive security. They don't say diversity, they say inclusive, so I don't know what the relationship is between those lingos. So in 2016, Sarah Sewell, U.S. Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, hailed CVE as, quote, a vital new dimension of the women, peace, and security agenda, unquote. Brushing aside concerns voiced by feminist critics within the UN and the NGO world, she urged women to get in on the ground floor of this nascent architecture and shape the agenda to ensure that women are involved and their perspectives incorporated in the security agendas of the UN. And scores of policy papers for think tanks, NGOs, governmental agencies, and international governance institutions deplore the fact that counterterrorism has been a man's world. And they extol the value of gender inclusion. And in the dialect of international governance, calls for including women in CVE are usually framed in terms of their concern as stakeholders. See this language. But what immediately caught my attention when I entered this brave new policy world is that to clarify what their stakes actually were, every document invoked the special dangers violent extremists pose to women. Sewell again put it most hyperbolically, she said, violent extremists are among the greatest threats to the empowerment of women and girls across the globe, not only in the crimes they commit, but in how they can fuel misogyny. Violent extremists repress women in both their ideology and their methods of violence, unquote. And one of the most intriguing securo-feminist groups that I ran across was the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership. It's called WASL, which has a meaning in other languages, connections, right? It was especially interesting because it was led by women's rights advocates from the global south, especially Pakistan. And they make the case for inclusion in CVE on slightly different grounds, pointing to women's histories of pioneering work on the ground. Women were the first to notice, they say, and often bear the brunt of these regressive forces that represent the antithesis of basic principles of human rights, democracy, and pluralism, unquote. Now, the staggering number of feminist groups a staggering number of feminist groups are involved in this CVE business. In the US, we have the US Institute for Peace, the US Department of State, the US Agency for International Development, pledging to collaborate with UNDP, UNESCO, the World Bank, the European Union. In the proliferating conferences and summits, reports, policy, briefs, toolkits, exercises, we see the telltale signs of the telltale vocabularies of gender experts. Gender sensitivity, gender mainstreaming, gender inclusivity, empowerment, resilience, and the human rights of women and girls. And a 2017 contract research report for the Australian government that I found that was on women and countering violent extremism actually counted 58 initiatives or networks working on women and CVE with clever acronyms like AWARE, ICAN, SAVE, RESOLVE, WARN, COVER, FATE, BRAVE, it goes on. Across the expanding field, they like the acronyms, right? Across the expanding field of secure feminism is a constant refrain. Violent extremists are the problem. If you read between the lines, you realize that violent extremists is a code word for Muslims, even though they all bend over backwards to say not tied to any religion or anything. It's just violent extremists, but they're always, every example shows you that it's a Muslim. So what I was seeing, what I see in the world of CVE, therefore, looked a lot like an extension of what I had written my book about, saving women from bad Muslim men. But now it's white and brown professional women hoping to join forces with white security men to save brown women from brown men. But as I've been following this for a few years, because I'm very slow and I just keep at it, I noticed something even stranger happening. So over the past 4 years or so, women in CVE began to come together in a new way that posed a challenge, I think, for the secure feminists who were trying to build their careers by representing extremists, aka Muslims, as the special enemies of women. On the website of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in 2017, I found a story that began with an intriguing question. Why is it so crucial that we apply a gender analysis when shaping our response to violent extremism? The ominous answer that was given by Chantal de Jong-Udrat, president of the Women in International Security, was that, quote, the pool of potential terrorists is no longer just angry young men, unquote. So a new sinister specter has emerged on the scene that confuses the picture that was carefully painted by secure feminists to justify their inclusion and leadership. And this is the non-innocent woman. Reports began to be published in 2014 on women as perpetrators. And the focus was on the women mostly who began to travel to Syria and Iraq from Europe and elsewhere to join the Islamic State. So now we need saving from them. Now, how the gender experts in the security industry portray these women is actually really revealing. Remnants of the story about victims needing to be saved by the West remain in the representations of these female migrants as vulnerable individuals who've been lured by extremist propaganda on the internet. And this has justified this massive growth of internet counter-messaging sponsored by Google and Facebook and others, and much of it based in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. But a summary of a workshop on women and extremism that was held at the U.S. Institute for Peace a couple of years ago suggests that Muslim women are gradually being expelled from the safe space of sympathy and saving. Here's a quote from the report. New research shows how women can stoke, support, and sometimes directly join in violent actions, unquote. And the reports on these potential perpetrators are not based on field work. When you read the reports, this is just so shoddy. Like, as a professor, it's shameful. They rely on press reports. They rely on a database that's built from monitoring migrant women's tweets and social media posts. And they're based on a few interviews with the de-radicalization mentors who are assigned to returnees who are being held in custody. And two studies I ran across epitomize this subgenre of subpar work on women and violent extremism. And both were published by the Women and Extremism program of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And their titles are trite: Becoming Mulan, Female Western Migrants to ISIS, and Till Martyrdom Do Us Part, Gender and the ISIS Phenomenon. And they lay out what they call the push and pull factors that led these women to leave, to go try to live under the caliphate. Here are the push factors: feeling isolated socially and or culturally, including questioning one's identity and uncertainty of belonging within a Western culture. Second one, feeling that the international Muslim community as a whole is being violently persecuted. And the third one, anger, sadness, and or frustration over a perceived lack of international action in response to this persecution, unquote. So note the psychological and emotional language used here. They feel this way. They're angry. They're sad. The reports describe how the women regularly share imagery in their posts and their tweets that show violence towards women and children in the deadly aftermaths of bombing and other kinds of wars. And they write about how concerned they are about the oppression of Muslims internationally. But the report glosses what they say to make it seem like they're crazy. And here's a typical example, an explanation given by a de-radicalization mentor. He says, throughout the process of radicalization, this is all a quote, throughout the process of radicalization, a cognitive behavioral pathway starts to build itself around the extremist propaganda that manifests itself in an alternative reality. The belief solidifies that Muslims as an international community have been persecuted violently by non-believers throughout history. So the third push factor, anger and frustration at the inaction of the international community to respond to the perceived violence that they're showing on their, in their posts, is also dismissed. The reports ignore the political analyses these women have about wars, about injuries, about foreign interventions in the Middle East and South Asia. They don't take seriously the well-documented discrimination and racism that Muslim women experience in Europe, Australia, and the United States, where appeals to security have justified domestic crackdowns and hysteria, including about Muslim women's attire, from burkinis to burqas, which are banned, as you know. When secure feminists do nothing to challenge the frameworks by which so-called women's radicalization is understood, like trying to understand pious women, things like that, which anthropologists have written a lot about, they contribute as much as the right-wing counterterrorism folks to placing all Muslims under the sign of extremism. And this new focus on women as associated with, rather than just victims of something called violent extremism, shows no signs of fading, even as ISIS has been defeated, and most of the women and men associated with it are dead, disappeared, or in prison awaiting trial. And on February 19th, 2019, I found a report. The US State Department issued its new, what's called US Strategy to Support Women and Girls at Risk from Violent Extremism and Conflict. So the strategy to protect them, to support them. But included in this strategy was a new item that hadn't been there in previous versions. And here's the quote: addressing the specific role of women as radicalizers, facilitators, or perpetrators of violence must play a role in any CVE strategy. Reintegrating former female members or supporters of terrorist organizations also requires tailored approaches to disengagement and reintegration, unquote. So luckily for secure feminists, in this latest twist, there's more work for them to do and more funding for their organizations to work on reintegration and disengagement. And it didn't surprise me to find a few months later a big report by UNDP done jointly with one of these secure feminist NGOs called Invisible Women. And it called for paying special attention to returnees and those being reintegrated. So there's more work. Now, secure feminists who demand inclusion in preventing violent extremism, countering violent extremism, I think find themselves mired in a world of undefined terms, trite advertising campaigns, and I wish I could share some of those with you, shoddy studies based on small numbers that all play on our fear of Muslims. When they repeat simplistic explanations like push and pull factors, I mean, really? It makes it hard for them to think more critically about the roots of the widespread violence that marks everyday lives around the world. Many would consider any resort to violence extreme. I do. Pacifists, feminist critics of war, those working against the patriarchal norms of masculinity and male dominance in politics have long organized against violence, whether in the home or the prison or in the international sphere. Is it reasonable to exclude from the category of extreme violence, the category of violent extremism, the extreme violence of shock and awe carried out by powerful armies, bombers, drones, proxy militias? Their effects on people and communities are catastrophic. Is it only the violence perpetrated by groups on the US terror list that is extremist? State terror is a term that never appears in the secure feminist literature, even though states and police are major perpetrators of gender violence. CVE and securitization never look at the history of the conflicts that are producing the violence, nor take responsibility. They never suggest that we should pursue political rather than military solutions. They never entertain the idea of banning arms production and sales, halting support for violent allies, or trying to limit massive destruction, injury, and death through poverty. All of these affect women deeply. They're all forms of gender violence. So I think the gendered lens of feminism is crucial, but I also think it needs to be wide-angled. Gender-based violence is not, unfortunately, the monopoly of any particular group. We've seen this in Afghanistan and Iraq, the terrible fallout when gender violence or misogyny are used as alibis for war. So my argument is that those who genuinely care about gender violence, which I think we all must and should be wary of participating in securitization. They shouldn't let their concern be used to fuel this violent circuit of global power, or either of the other two that we isolated in our book. Thank you. Let's start with a
We're
more
taping,
kind of
so we need to use
theoretical question. It says, you said the circuits of power that gender violence animates. Are you saying that gender violence has a life beyond the physical harm? Right? And yes, I'm talking about gender violence as it's made into a master category and circulates, and it does have a life well beyond the actual harms that are being done to people. It's actually being used. That's what I'm trying to get at. I don't know who gave me the question, but it's a very important question. That's part of the way we're thinking about this, that it's not just the things that happen, but the ways they're taken up and how they get used as categories in creating institutions, in allowing certain kinds of activities to occur. Right, yeah, definitely it has a life beyond the physical in a really powerful way. So I think that's a really great question. Can I answer? This one isn't really so closely related, but I love it. So what do you think about Michelle Obama's women and girls education? Let girls learn. Was this in keeping with your thesis or counterpoint? So I actually, this whole project is not about girls' education, although many people have written about that and the way it circulates as internationally. But I just wanted to tell one story because it was so amazing to me. So I've done a little bit of work in Qatar with the National Museum of Qatar because they asked me to help them, just advise them a bit on one of the galleries that they were putting together for the National Museum, which was about Bedouin lifestyle. Which was part of their past and part of my past in terms of the first 2 books that I wrote about and the first, many years of my life when I had the wonderful privilege of living with the Bedouin group in Egypt. So I didn't know about Qatar, but I was willing to do some research to try to help them. And I was really, the reason I said yes was that I really didn't want it to be orientalized. I didn't want it to be folklorized. These are really living people with a wonderful, rich lives. And I've written about their poetry. I just didn't want it all to be about camels and things like that. So I said, yes, I'll help with this. And actually the director of the museum had read my book, Veiled Sentiments, and she wanted it to also be good on the gender question, because the original plan for the gallery had been like 2 galleries. All the men were in one with war and falcon hunting and all that, and the women were in the tents and the, milking over here. And I said, hey, these people are really closely related to each other, and the men live in the tents and the women, go out with the herds. So we did that. So we were sitting around a table on one of my very short visits with the whole research staff of the museum and the director of the museum, who's a woman, the head curator, who's a woman, all the Qatari researchers who were women. And we're sitting around the table, and Michelle Obama was coming to town to push girls' education. And I'm looking around the table at the head of the director of the National Museum is a woman. The researchers are all women. The experts are women. The head of the whole museum authority of like 5 museums is a woman, Sheikha Mayasa. The head of Education City, which is this huge educational enterprise with Northwestern and Georgetown and all the other universities there, that's the Sheikh Moza. That's run by a woman too. So I'm thinking, Michelle Obama needs to come here to tell them about girls' education. I would really love to see an American institution that had that many women at the top. So it was just this moment, like, you need to think about it. Thank you. Sorry, obviously people should get educated, but don't go to Qatar because they're Muslim women and they wear black abayas and tell them that they need to get educated when every single woman is highly educated, of a certain group there, of course. But they're running all the major cultural and educational institutions in the country. I was flabbergasted by it all and thought, this is really great. I love this. But anyway, so that's that. What else? Can you pick one for me?
Yeah, this one looks, this is an interesting one.
Okay. What are the racial, ethnic backgrounds of people who are securo-feminists? Is it all white women? It could be, but I mentioned one group. I don't think it all is, which is very interesting. It's mostly European and Americans, and people based here. But it actually includes a lot of third world elite women who are in the NGO world, in international organizations, and the one I didn't have time today to talk about the whole pamphlet. I have a big analysis of their presentation of the group called WASL, the Women's Leadership, what's it called? Women's Alliance for Leadership and Security. And that was very international group of women, but I assume they're all the kinds of elites that circulate within the UN world and the development world, but it wasn't just white women. So that's interesting to me, but you might think about the ways in which, remember I said something about how feminists, many mainstream feminists really have a suspicion of religion and are actually quite hostile to religious people, very secular, especially elsewhere in the world. And so that, I think, complicates the situation and makes them more ready to join in with this vilification of Islamic extremists and Muslims in general in a funny way. People who are religious, people who are pious, and that's been the hard part with the reports I told you about, becoming Mulan, those things about the women who migrated, because nobody refers in the longer version, in the book version of what I'm talking about here. I refer to this incredibly good literature that we have in anthropology about pious women, women who choose their faith, they want to organize their lives around it, they want to be close to God. You know, we understand that that's a legitimate thing to be and still be a woman and still be a feminist. But somehow that can't fit in this story. And they don't refer to any of that literature or even take seriously what the women are saying about why they're doing what they're doing. They want to live under an Islamic, you know, it didn't work out too well, but the idea was to live a good Islamic way and live in their religion. We have to take that seriously, but their agency, their ideas, their desires are never mentioned in these kinds of reports. They're just lured by the internet, by extremist propaganda to do this crazy stuff. And I think they do well to read some anthropology. That's my feeling. Okay.
This one would be.
Thank you. How does security relate? Very good question. How does securitization, of gender-based violence relate to colonial histories of policing, technologies of gender-based oppression? I don't think I can answer that, but I think that's a very good question, to think about the histories and think about the ways in which gender violence was done and portrayed differently in colonial situations. And one of the endings of one of my talks, I ended, actually in India, I ended it this way, was I referred to Latamani and her arguments about sati, you know, the widow immolation, and her amazing argument, which has been really helpful for me too, is to say, you know, women were neither the objects nor the subjects of this whole discourse around sati, right? They were the ground. They were the ground. And actually what the guys were all arguing about was tradition and creating some kind of notion of tradition. And I think I need to ask something like that about what's going on here, which is like the gender violence has a life beyond the physical. What's all this concern about gender violence doing? Is it actually enabling, I mean, part of my argument is it's enabling the securitization to develop. So we need to ask about what it's doing in the world, what it enables, what it's pushing, what it's hiding. And I think the same thing has been true in colonial situations and contemporary colonial situations, as my colleague Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian is writing about in her work on the violent policing of Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. It's very much about a colonial situation and the use of gender violence, but also its erasure in consciousness as a form of GBV. And that's what she's trying to bring out. Like, look at what they're actually doing to these girls when they're trying to walk to school. That's GBV, but it's not called that.
Another one, which is many of the questions.
Do you want to answer any of these?
No.
I feel like I'm doing all the talking around
doing
here.
The work here, but you know, a number of the questions are very similar. Very similar. So it's people are thinking along certain lines. They're hard. This one is so tiny. It's hard to read.
Mary from Misas. Where's that? Where's Mary from Misas? Hi. How are you? What I said. International. this is a great question. To what extent is the inclusion of women in these international security apparatuses conditional on the weaponization of the very misogyny securo-feminists combat via the introduction of affective posturing that justifies humanitarian intervention? Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's the answer. I mean, you want to just keep thinking about these questions of weaponized. I don't use the word weaponized very often, but some of my colleagues do. Instrumentalize, I sometimes use. That one makes a little more sense, that you use it for a purpose that wasn't its original intent, or you're using it for something else, that it was actually intended to do something good, but then you instrumentalize it to create some other situation to justify something else. And I think those are the ways that, and I use the word hijack for the first time in this talk, which I'm not that happy with. I don't usually like that. I think the governance feminist people have a better way. They do Nancy Fraser's uncanny doubles that, you know, are you feminists, or are you, this looks like feminism, but it's not feminism. Once it gets caught up in these power systems, but it looks like it's doing some good here, it looks like it's saving, but it's not really saving, it's actually strengthening, you know, borders, things like that. And we don't know all the, you know, I just taught it, right? So we just taught the governance feminism stuff, and they're the 5 C's that they talk about. You know, what happens to feminists when they get in these institutions and tied up with power? There's collusion, there's compromise, there's, I can't remember what the 5 C's are. Do you remember? Complicity. So, you know, we're all trying to think about what happens when feminism gets into power in some way, and what happens to it, and how does it lose its principles, or lose its radicalism, or end up feeding things that actually make the situations worse that it was intended to sort of fight, which is, I think, on the gender violence question. You know, it's so complicated, but that's what we're trying to sort out, and we don't always have the vocabulary, but I think what I think people are picking up on, and I think is absolutely right, is to start asking, okay, so what's going on here? Don't take it at face value. What's it connected to? What's it doing over here while we're looking over here? How are these things connected to each other? And do we want to be part of something that's going to have those kinds of effects over there? Of course, we want to be against gender violence, of course. But what's going to make it more possible for there to be less gender violence? Is it securitization, or is it peace? You know, is it, you know, economic change, you know, stability? You know, and you look at these refugee camps, it's heartbreaking, right? And why not say, hey, come on, open your borders? Like, why are these people trapped in these refugee camps with no soap? And they just have to do, you know, human rights training to recognize domestic violence. I mean, give me a break, right? And so why is that outside the frame? Why is that not what we should be working on as feminists, maybe, which doesn't look maybe like a feminist issue per se, but it might be actually, it might do more good for women and other human beings. We don't want to only care about women, but you know, it's complicated, but it's sort of the way of thinking, the kind of hermeneutics of suspicion, like what's going on here? What's going on here when we're not looking? That's what I've been interested in, with the same thing with, do Muslim women need saving?
Right.
I mean, the Taliban are not really great. I agree. But, you know, what brought the Taliban to power? What's going to solve the situation? And look at Afghanistan now. It's terrible.
Who's speaking about
What?
and who's worrying about the well-being of these women? You know, are they worried about women in the countries that they live in? Are they worried
right. Well,
about
that's the
what their states are doing? I think that those are you know, the issues that you brought up so clearly. We have another one. What do you know about R. Kelly?
Do I know about R. Kelly?
Do you?
I don't.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. I'm going to hand it to her, but...
Why don't you answer it then? Do you know it?
Well, I think it would be, I mean, it's a question about what does the case of R. Kelly, who's a well-known rap singer, who's been, so I think.
Me and the Pulse of the Nation, they joke
Yeah,
about
I
us.
think, but you'll talk to your daughter about it.
Okay,
and
I'll
some of
talk
your
to my daughter.
students. It's a very good question. Who, were there more? Okay. Did you want to?
Okay, we get one.
Oh, well, some of these have been.
It's a long one, though. You gotta watch out.
This is good for. Yeah.
I mean, all the questions are
These
good.
are all good.
We're not judging
They're
the
all great.
questions. It's just some of them are
Well, these are
similar,
even
I think,
related.
and also we can't really think on our feet. How do you see secure feminism engaging with contemporary digital conditions of production and circulation of nebulous discourse, images, videos on terror, gender, race, identity? That's great.
And this is also social media. So
Yeah,
you might-
social media. To what extent does social media provide the archive of violence by women? And if this is significant, how can it be contextualized? These are really wonderful questions about social media. And I mentioned that the reports, the like awful reports that I read about the returnees, the migrants, rely almost completely on their tweets and their social media, so their accounts are totally monitored. And that's all people know, and you don't really know what they're saying, who they're saying it to, whether they are the ones saying it or not. So it's a very tricky domain, but that's the world in which all of this lives. And the way I started, well, like the first time I gave a talk on this, I started with, I'm sure you all remember this image that went viral when Trump went to Saudi Arabia, and he was with Sisi, the Egyptian president, right? And they had their hands on this glowing globe together, and they were in this place full of computers, and it was actually the inauguration of a, I forget what it's called now, but a counter-messaging, interference with the internet around violent extremism. So it's called, counter-ideology. So if they're putting out these messages, we're going to put out these counter messages about what Islam should be, and don't listen to those people. So it's this huge enterprise, all on the internet. Plus there are the algorithms, people write about all this stuff, and Google, in my longer version of my paper, there's all these companies that are involved in the counter-ideological warfare. So the world is very much in that media sphere, this world that we're living in, and secure feminism. I haven't taken it as my object of study, but I sort of looked at it and go, wow, what's going on here? But I think that's something people really have to look to try to understand the politics of security. Secure feminists, I don't think they're as involved, as savvy as the larger security world, but the world is taking place in that sphere, and a lot of the arguments. And one of my colleagues, is this related or not? But it was pretty shocking. One of my colleagues is an anthropologist, a Dutch anthropologist, who has a big, Annelies Moers, who also worked in Palestine before, and she had a big EU grant. They get these amazing 5-year, multi-million-dollar grants that we don't have in America. But she had this big project on Muslim marriage, and one of the people, she was very interested in jihadi marriages, which are all sort of all on the internet and da-da-da, and they had a research assistant who had been, or somehow she was connected into this, networked into this world, and so she was doing the research for that part of the project of Muslim marriage under the caliphate, and Annelies Moers was brought before Parliament for aiding and abetting terrorism by having a research assistant who was looking at the media, the social media, and interacting with people online who were involved in this. So she actually was hauled up there. She was cleared eventually, but it was kind of amazing that that world could come into this world in a very powerful way, and even the academy, and that she would be, what kind of research is this, where you're using terrorists to do research on terrorists? So it was a very interesting moment, but she made it.
Here's a little bit different question.
What happened to, did we do this? Social media.
Yeah.
Where's Arvin's? Was that Arvin's?
Yeah, his was on social media.
Social media.
Yeah,
Well,
so
you would know much more about this than I do. But I think it's really, a lot of it is happening there, and the counter-messaging was very interesting to me, and these big centers. The center in Saudi Arabia was called, the translation was like toleration or something like that, so it's offering an alternative version of Islam, and they're just hundreds of computers and people working, producing this stuff. And I wrote about something else, which I found, I found so much stuff out there, of something called peer-to-peer that was, I don't know if it was Homeland Security or somebody did these competitions for university groups to get together and come up with social media that was against extremism. And then they had these competitions, and they brought them to Washington, and they got prizes and gold medals for doing the best social media against extremism. So peer-to-peer, it was called peer, to peer. But how much can you write about? It's just, I had a thing about cartoons. There's so many competitions out there. Okay, how does the This is a really important issue that I don't think I have an answer to, so I would really be interested in thinking about it. How does the restriction of reproductive rights here in the US play into gender violence? I mean, there are a lot of ways in which one can think of the restriction of reproductive rights as violent, both in terms of the earlier sterilizations and now in terms of trying to take away the right to choose, but I wouldn't say there's one could call it a form of gender violence, but it's part of a whole politics which you want to think about, not just on that issue, not just in the bodies, but in the larger political sphere, which is also promoting a lot of other things that are going to be tough on women. But I would think that would be the way to go with that, but maybe somebody could help with that. But I think it's a really important issue that we didn't really come across it. What? Global gag rule? Yeah, and restricting funding for all kinds of, for Planned Parenthood and for around the world. Yeah, absolute politics of international politics caught up in that.
The very same people who are involved in saving
these women are also
denying them resources.
Right.
So this one will be interesting. It's about from the point of view of development practitioner. So that, I think that's a challenge that many people who work in the field find. These are great.
This is great. I think we should have the people who ask the questions answer them, because they're really good. So let me share the questions so that you can see. As a development practitioner, in quotes, I don't know why, how can we incorporate your analysis into gender programming in country? How do we go up against the political forces that block us from seeking state accountability for gender violence, for example, with the police? That's like the million-dollar question, right? Sort of, how do you work for good within the systems when you can't, when if you criticize some things, you end up supporting something else that you don't agree with. And the question of working from within, I mean, we talk about this all the time, especially among the group that I've been so lucky to be with, because I feel like I have it easy. I'm just an academic. I'm just a scholar. I don't have to decide what to do except write. So I can give you the critique, but I don't know how that critique should affect the way I act in these situations, and I luckily haven't tried to. I just can't, right? But most of the people involved in the project, the collective project of this book, are people who have a foot in both worlds and call themselves scholar activists and sometimes development people. I mean, they work in development organizations. Sometimes they work with feminist groups on the ground in various places trying to do good things. And yet, what?
Yeah, no, I've done, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. That's
and
why I
it's
thought
very
it was-
difficult,
yeah.
but I think to do it blindly, I don't know that anybody does it blindly, really. And I don't think there are any answers, but I think maybe you decide what is the most crucial thing that matters to you the most to work on. And yes, there may be other consequences that are not what you would like to see, but better than not doing something at all. I mean, you get caught in this all the time. I think anybody who's a practitioner, who's involved in these worlds, and I don't know how you do it. Yeah.
Listening to the people on the ground, I think that's many cases where you're going to get the best.
So you do this. You're involved in this kind of work.
I
too?
have been,
Yeah.
and I think that that's where I found a safer route, is by really just listening to people on the ground about what their needs are, the women on the ground, or those who are experiencing gender-based violence, but from their perspective, rather than the agencies that are asking for, sort of designing the projects, and want to design the project from outside as opposed to listening to the needs of the folks on the ground. I think that's one avenue that can put you in a better place. It's very complicated, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, when I read there were a few studies of the refugee camps in which the Yazidi women survivors are based, and they did listen, not the agencies, but the ethnographers talked to the women, and they really wanted to move on. They did not want to have to keep trotting out their stories and reliving it for the media. And the joke, the journalists are coming like, has anybody here been raped? Can I, it's like, please.
Well, this was the story of Bosnia.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Bosnia was first. So, that's part of listening, I think, to what people want. And the ethnographer, our colleague who wrote about the refugee camp in Tanzania was just so I mean, it's like the women just, can we have soap? And they said, no, there's no money for soap. It's like, can we have a job? No, there's no money for jobs. The only funding is for human rights training for girls and women. It's like, how did that happen?
Here are two different questions. So one brings us into the warrior women, and so maybe that's one, and then maybe we'll end with this one that asks about, but how do we, great lecture, agreed with all, but how do we explain the attacks on gender studies and anthropologists by the extreme right in many countries? So those are two questions, one very different. I think the first one speaks to some of the questions around the non-innocent woman.
In the realm of the non-innocent woman, how do you think about the sensationalizing and sexualization of the warrior woman, the PKK, YPG, SDF, Lebanese Revolutionary Forces, etc.? That's a really interesting question, because they've actually been treated differently. And so I would want to think about why certain groups get not romanticized, but can be warrior women, positively viewed. Which complex are they involved in? Who's on their side? What are they fighting for? And we've had, it's interesting in all the literature on the secure feminist literature that I've read, there is a lot of work on, so what are actually the women, the migrants didn't fight because they weren't allowed to fight, so they actually weren't violent or doing anything because they weren't allowed to until I think the last weeks or something like that. So they aren't fighting women. But in the reports, occasionally you'll see a mention of Tamil tigers, or there are women who have been freedom fighters and all of that, but that never gets translated to the Islamists, right? That they're never freedom fighters. And I don't know why that history doesn't get brought up. And of course the Palestinians are another example that's sometimes brought up and put away because people don't quite know whether they support what they did or not, and is it freedom fighting or is it terrorism? So all of that. But I think that would be something to elaborate on for here, but I don't think any of the new specter of the non-innocent Muslim woman who migrated to join Daesh has been incorporated into this warrior woman notion, maybe because they just can't be romanticized in any way, and the cause itself is so vilified. But yeah, but we have a course up at Columbia. Nimi Gauranatham, is that her name? Teaches a half course at SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs, every year on fighting women. And we had a conference last year on fighting women, which was very interesting, and they wanted me to speak. I said, well, it's not exactly fighting women, but they wanted that included. But they were people who looked at kind of revolutionary groups in Africa and Tamil Tiger, those other groups that where women actually were fighting for a cause. And they don't seem to be vilified in the same way, but maybe they are in their own countries. But I think that's really worth thinking about as a comparison, and why some get celebrated, maybe sensationalized, but celebrated, and others can't possibly get to that point of being recognized as fighting for a cause if they are violent. So, good question. What's this last one? Great lecture. Yeah. Thank you, whoever said this. How do you explain the attacks on gender studies and anthropologists by the extreme right, Brazil, Hungary, Poland? Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. I think would you like to talk about it? Actually, it came up last week, right, when we had the book launch for this new book. We had a book launch at Columbia with Denise Candioti and Nadia Lali, who works on Iraq, and were you there? Did you come? No, yeah. And Catherine Spellman-Poots, who's at Columbia with us now, running the Islamic Studies program, and they co-edited a book which is a kind of sequel to a very well-known book for those of you who are in our field called Women in the State and Islam. What? Women Islam in the State, or Women in the State and Women in Islam in the State. But this was called Gender Governance Islam. So they switched from women, so that was 1991, and it was a really path-breaking book, and it went country by country and had an analysis that didn't blame anything on Islam, but actually looked at power politics and how nationalism, state building, actually had a huge effect on women's status and rights in those various countries. So the new book, as I pointed out, it's interesting to look at the change in the title. It became Gender from Women, because we've moved forward, and Governance instead of the State. So we don't talk about the state anymore, we talk about governance, but Islam stayed the same. But I haven't read the book, but Denise Candioti was on about that. She calls it patriarchal restoration, and she thought that's what's going on across all these right-wing regimes everywhere. Patriarchal restoration and sort of a backlash against feminism, and anthropology would always be, actually caring about minority groups and ethnic groups and racial groups. So of course we would not be good news for political movements that are based on xenophobia and racism. So I think that might be why anthropologists get lumped in with feminists on this. But something is going on there that is this kind of nationalist, xenophobic populism. But I don't know how to understand it, and I'm not very good at those big political questions. But there is something happening there, and I'm always amazed by it. I remember when Judy Butler went to Brazil for a conference, and they were burning effigies of her as a witch. And gender theory is destroying the family. And you're going, gender theory? I told my son about this. He says, wow, that's obviously very successful gender theory. that, you know, they think it's destroying the family, it's destroying society. And France has the same gender theory. Judy Butler is the enemy. They carry science against her. I mean, it's very interesting.
That's why it's so important to co-opt. You know, it seems to me that if it's so powerful, then the idea of co-opting the notion of gender-based violence and the idea that, empowering women in a certain way by certain groups or people will take the place of that critical approach, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that what gives a lot of people anxiety, right? So perhaps that's the answer, that I don't know what the person was thinking. Is there anybody else who has a question? There are a number of questions here that were just more or less different ways of posing the questions that were asked. But I want to thank absolutely everybody for great public and thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for being here and hanging out for so long. But we can probably talk a bit afterwards.
Absolutely, I
if your
think there's
question
probably
didn't get
still
answered,
maybe there's
or
some
give
food
me the
back there,
answers
I don't
that you
know.
wish that I had been able to give you.
But please take a moment to say hello, and let's hear again for everyone, and also for Dee and all those people who helped.
Thank you, Dee. Thank you, everybody.